Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Dorothy Figuera, who's visiting from the Comparative Literature Department at the University of Georgia. Dorothy Figuera earned her BA at Vassar College, her MA diplôme in Classical Religion from the University of Paris, a Master of Theological Studies in the History of Religion at the Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD at the University of Chicago in Comparative Literature. She has published numerous articles in professional journals. She's the author of at least 3 books. These include Aryans, Jews, Brahmins, Theorizing Authority, 2002. Her book, Otherwise Occupied, Theories and Pedagogies of Alterity, is under contract. She also has a book manuscript in progress entitled Traces of the Other, Religion and Race in Travel Narrative, and she served as President Pro Tem of the International Comparative Literature Association, and I believe now is Vice President of that association. Dorothy, it's great to have you here.
It's great being here.
So tell us, first of all, the study of religion. How did you come to that?
Well, I didn't quite know what to study in college. And I decided I would try doing some things that I knew nothing about whatsoever. And my brother had some books laying around the house on myth that I found very interesting. So I thought, well, maybe I'll study this. And I just went into a class on myth and found it to be very interesting. And then I proceeded to take some other classes. And I had the opportunity of studying abroad when I was in college, and I went to France, and it's a really beautiful story. I was looking for the ladies' room in the Sorbonne, and I got lost. And I ended up in the religious science faculty of the École pratique des hautes études. And I said, I was only, what you can only do when you're youthful, say, I can go in here, let's see what they're offering. And so as an undergraduate, I walked into what were essentially graduate seminars. And I suppose I was such an odd bird that everyone was very gracious and let me sit in on wonderful seminars. And I fell in love with the study of religion as it was done in France, sort of as a religious science. And when I came back to the States, I decided, well, I really wanted to find a way to continue doing this, and then I proceeded to do that. I ultimately was interested in religion and literature, and I was doing it in religion programs. And then it took me a long time to realize that that was perhaps not the proper venue. And I ended up opting for literature, comparative literature. Because in those years, comparative literature was really the site of interdisciplinary studies. Now you study, there are now interdisciplinary departments and humanities institutes. But back in the 70s, if you couldn't make up your mind on what you wanted to study, you could go to comparative literature, music and literature, philosophy and literature, religion and literature, the visual arts and literature. And so there was a space there in comparative literature for interdisciplinary work, and it was a wonderful fit. I've been able to live happily ever after in comparative literature.
And you've also studied a lot of languages. Just give the audience some ideas of the languages you've studied.
Well, I studied the languages because I went.
Which languages?
Well, I started with French. I'd gone to a very poor public school system, and it went bankrupt. Actually, I'm a high school dropout. The school system went bankrupt, and we were sitting in study halls for hours and hours a day, and I was able to jump into college. But I hadn't had a chance to learn languages, so I started studying languages, and I just enjoyed it terribly. When you're young, you listen to music, and I was learning the languages through listening to the music. And I jokingly say that listening to Jacques Brel taught me French. Listening to bad Sergio Franchi records of my grandfather taught me Italian. Listening to Schubert Lieder, my German is much nicer than my Italian. But I wanted to study religion, and I realized I needed those languages to read the scholarship. So I started with my European languages, and then started with the classics, and did my Latin and Greek, and then when I was in France and I mentioned that I was interested in studying mythology, then they said, well, you have to learn Sanskrit. So I tried to learn Sanskrit it was my interest in Indo-European mythology. They said, well, you have to do Sanskrit.
Right.
And that was a painful, difficult thing to do because it's always a bad idea to learn a language, in a foreign language. It's
You think so?
well, it's very,
Yeah,
very difficult. You
yeah.
think, and you come out in the wrong language.
Right.
You're trying to learn.
So you studied Sanskrit in France, in other words.
Yeah. So you're trying to learn a language, and it also happened when I was studying German in France. You translate, but you're working, of course, always in English, and then you're doing a double process of translation.
Yeah. So is that how you got interested in India?
Through myth.
Through
myth.
But
When you studied myth, when you look at myth, you were looking at, those are the years when you looked at Indo-European mythology. I mean, I didn't go the Norse route. I could have equally gone the Norse route, but I just did the Latin. It was very popular. There was a school of mythological studies in France that focused on the Greek, Latin, and Indic materials. And so I was focusing on that. Scandinavia seemed very, very distant.
Yeah. Well, tell me, this was Détienne and Vernon. Were they inspiring figures in the classroom? Maybe this is not the because their books are impressive. What was their technique like? What was their teaching style?
Well, these were not. These were not what one would consider classes, undergraduate classes. People were basically working. I was sitting there, a undergraduate or a graduate student, sitting in on classes where the other students were junior professors. So it was a discussion about works that they were in the process of doing. It was on a much higher level. I was really there, and I think the professors were very kind. They realized I was this American student there who was serious and was trying by osmosis to glean something, and I would sit and be quiet, and I wouldn't interject, and so it was not so much that type of learning experience. It was me reading a lot and me listening to lectures of the various professors who were all there. It was a class of professors, and I was an auditor more or less. But I did churn out my master's thesis. It was very interesting because I felt they ultimately had me work on Dionysus, and I didn't want to work on Dionysus, and they had me work on female sacrificial colleges. And they did this because I was a female, and I remember thinking that was a generational difference, and that was the difference of being an American coming out of a girls' school, a historical female college, was I felt that I was being constrained by the fact that as a female I should be balkanized into studying women.
And women who were sacrificed.
Women who were sacrificing.
Sacrificers, yeah, that's
sacrificing. And that was I think my first conceptualization of the risks of balkanization within academia. That women study women's studies, Hispanics must do Spanish. And that you're defined by your gender and ethnicity,
right? So
which is something I've always bridled at.
Right, discomfort with this, I guess, what's called identity politics.
Well, I was working. I think if I go back, this was a long time ago. I think I was working on phallic processions. So I really resented that I had to leave phallic processions to deal with women sacrificing.
Your 2002 book, Aryans, Jews, and Brahmins. Can you just give us an idea of what the overarching thesis of that book is?
Oh, I think it's best explained in terms of a continuum. And as we were discussing earlier, I'm very interested in this notion of identity. I think, for personal reasons, as being a first-generation American, as being a minority within academia, as being a working-class person who's had the experience of elite institutions, issues of identity concern me. And I was always very interested, beginning in my first classes, on why did people go elsewhere? Why did people seek an identity beyond themselves? What that meant in terms of rights and privileges, what that meant about one's sense of belonging to a society. And so all of my books basically deal with this issue of going beyond the self to seek, whether it be spiritual or aesthetic compensation. And this notion that one has to have a place within one's own society to be able to reject that society within the terms of, as Naipaul, I think, put it in the Eva Peron book, with a round-trip ticket, to be able to partake of something else, but know that you had a place back home to go back to after you had your little
fling.
And so I was fascinated with this. And of course, these were the years of the 70s, where you're sitting in Indian religion classes with TM practitioners, other people.
Transcendental meditation.
Transcendental meditation people, devotees of some sort or another. You're smelling their hair that's infused with incense. Everyone is into yoga. And I always felt odd man out because I was really not on any spiritual quest here, and yet I was surrounded by people on a spiritual quest. And then I started questioning, well, why am I not on why do I feel I can't afford a spiritual quest? And it was clearly a level I could not afford a spiritual quest. I couldn't waste my time on a spiritual quest. I was there to study and learn something so I could become employable. And so my initial book on translating the Orient was basically, what did these people look for when they were going as far away as India? There was, if you wanted God, there were gods closer to home. You could make the shift from Catholicism to Judaism. You did not have to go to Hinduism. And so the second book on the exotic and the decadence of exotic quests carried this on a larger sort of artistic and philosophical level. So when Nietzsche was looking eastward, what was he looking for? The laws of Manu. When those French people were writing operas and ballets dealing with bayaderas and sutis and pariahs, what were they? What was the game here? What was at issue here? And then finally, I think I see them all as it's a sort of a triptych that this Aryans, Jews, and Brahmins was to look once again at this notion of a fantasy identity that people are seeking beyond in the other. And what I liked so much about that project was I really tried to make it go in both directions, because those were the heydays when people were looking at East looking westward and not necessarily looking at Westerners looking eastward and not looking at Easterners looking westward. And so on the notion of identity and who are the Aryans, these fictitious or non-fictitious people, I wanted to see what Westerners were projecting onto this mythic ancestor, and I wanted to see what Indians were projecting onto these mythic ancestors. And rather than base it on anthropological work or studies of chronology or anthropology, I focused on those readings of what it was to be Aryan that were based on Sanskrit canonical sources, but filtered down into the general public. In India, on the level of reform movements within Hinduism, and in the West, in terms of just where the Aryans started entering into discussions, beginning with Voltaire and Diderot, moving up to the racial theorists. I stopped short of National Socialism because I wanted to basically look at what brought us to that the idea that we were talking about Aryans circa 1933. So I basically stopped with the reformulation of the Nuremberg racial laws.
And the Enlightenment, you're just talking about, I guess you mentioned Diderot. So who first started talking about the Aryans? Of course, people know that was Hitler's, that was the Nazi, the Aryan, this super race and so on. And what did it mean for the Enlightenment for people like Diderot?
Well, when the starting in the early 18th century, when you found missionaries, and now I'm of course working on that period, looking at the travel narratives. When people first went eastward, they were saying, who are these people and what is their relationship to us? And what is similar? And it started with somewhere back in 1735 or so with Filippo Sassetti saying, this language, this Sanskrit language, looks a lot like Italian and looks a lot like Latin, and it seems to be a bit like Greek syntactically, and what is this all about? And then we have this quest for who are we? These are the same years, of course, that we're talking about what is the nature of language. And we have Herder, we have many discussions about where is language divine, is language man-made, where does language come from? And then the question is, why is our language similar to this language from so far away? Who are these people? Are these people our ancestors? Where it gets squirrely and interesting is when we start projecting our past onto these people because of these linguistic affinities. And what the book basically is discussing, at least from the Western perspective, was there was this desire to seek a past in India. And it was not, to a certain extent, it was because of admiration one had for what one understood about Indian philosophy. But the same admiration was projected onto China. But China was so much more distant, and the language was so much more impenetrable than Sanskrit, that it was difficult to make a case. And racially, Europeans were so different from the Chinese. Whereas with light-complected Indians, there could be this projection. And so very, very early on, it became clear that the discussion was less about India and more about who we were as Europeans, and where we placed ourselves in the large vision of man. And ultimately, it became the Indians became very very useful props in a European attempt to distantiate oneself from the Hebrew tradition. We did not descend from the Jews. We do not descend from this. The Hebrew has nothing to our language. However, we can look in Sanskrit and we can see an affinity here. Okay, so what does this tell us about ourselves? This was at the same time, of course, as we move on through time, where there is questioning what is the German nation, what is the Italian nation. It's a very interesting phenomenon. France, they knew who they were, but the Germans and the Italians had a lot of issues. The Russians also were speculating a little bit. Who are those people in relationship to us?
Well, people know the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and his theory of the Übermensch, or the Superman, which was so influential in Nazi ideology. So you see a connection then between Nietzsche's ideas and Indian philosophy. But is this talked about very much, say, in philosophy departments, the influence of India on his thought?
Well, what was fun about this was it was a bit of a detective. There's a bit of a detective search here because the texts are texts are very limited, and we know when they're translated, and we know when people had access to them, and so we knew where people could get some of their ideas. So it's just a question of then looking into people's libraries and looking into what people are saying to realize what they're reading and what they're getting from it. And Nietzsche, very early on, although his high school buddy was a translator of the Vedanta, and he had access to many, many Sanskrit texts, he sort of loved the laws of Manu. And the laws of Manu are very strict laws and give us many of the caste regulations. Many of the things that form Indian notions of caste come from Manu, and it's an authoritative law book. The very fact that he chose to read Manu as opposed to, say, the Vedanta, showed that he was looking for something specific in India, just as those readings of the Bhagavad Gita. I've also written on the people who've, someone choosing to translate the Bhagavad Gita in the trenches of the First World War. And he reads the Bhagavad Gita not as a mystical poem, but as a call to Aryan knighthood to go out and sacrifice oneself.
This is Nietzsche?
No, I'm talking about a translator of the Bhagavad Gita.
I see.
Or the fact that some lunatic fringe Greek-French woman during World War II reads the Gita as Arjuna being a reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. So there are these, you look into these texts that are difficult, and you project onto those texts what you need from that terribly foreign culture, which we, of course, do ourselves, and we continue to do. And certainly, you can find that in all of these quests.
Now, what about otherwise occupied? How does that either continue or is a new departure?
It's a bit of a departure.
Yeah.
The otherwise occupied came out of experiences in the classroom, teaching literary theory to undergraduates, experiences teaching comparative literature in the South, issues of race and ethnicity as they are institutionalized within academe. I'm interested in how foreign cultures are being packaged in institutions. How world literature can find a home now in an English department, which is very different from world literature taught in comparative literature departments, where you have professors who have knowledge of the languages and the traditions, teaching in a different contextual manner than, say, the manner in which an English professor would teach Pushkin. So I suppose it was my administrative work at running a department for a few years and trying to negotiate the fact that with the onslaught of multiculturalism in the classroom, and in the South, multiculturalism is a very domestic phenomenon. Hyphenated classes, Korean American, Haitian American, rather than multicultural in a more global sense. That I was sort of looking at, well, what's the politics of projects here? How are we consuming the world? What does it mean when we consume the world in translation without demanding our students enter into those cultures in a more profound level, whether it be linguistically or historically? And so that book was basically a rumination on what sort of teaching being in the trenches and what's happening with the world in those years that we. It starts off. It's very much a post 9/11 situation. In the last 30 years, when we've been talking so much about globalization and responsibility toward the other, we have become far less capable of actually engaging the other on any real level. So it was very much the notion of no one could read those communiques in Arabic because no one in the State Department, or because there were only 9 majors in Arabic those years in American colleges. And what is that? And this is in the age of globalization. This is in the age when we have opened up the university supposedly to the other, where we are being more ethically conscientious vis-a-vis the other, and yet we are there's a certain level of play acting here. Are we really dealing with the other?
Right.
I mean, is it responsible to teach Islam and literature when no one on the teaching staff knows anything about Islam or Arabic?
Right.
These sorts of situations, and what does this politically mean for the institutions?
What's the alternative, though, to not teaching Islam?
No, I think one has to teach Islam.
Yeah.
One
No, I
has
mean,
to
but
teach.
even in the English department, if you want to teach, mahfuz or something like that, I mean, do we just have to sort of get by with, or is it a question of the way?
I think there's a certain danger in having someone who's a specialist in Lacan teach the Quran. That if that specialist in Lacan knows nothing about Islamic culture or Arabic,
Yeah.
I think that's worse than when things are left out of the canon altogether.
But do you think that's what happens? Do you think you suddenly
I
get
know
these?
that's what
No, but
happens.
do you think you get these Lacanian readings of the Quran?
I know of an instance at an institution where I used to work where they decided to have courses on Islam and literature, and it was taught by no one who was at all capable.
I see. So in other words, in this desire to teach about these other cultures, you completely assimilate it and.
No, but it's a dumbing down and it's a fragmentation. There's a new Pelican volume on world literature, and they have American Indian literature here. And in these pages devoted to American Indian literature, they're evoking Rabelais, Cervantes, Breton, Michaud, X number of writers who have nothing to do with American. So is it worse to pretend that you're dealing with a topic and do something else? Is that worse than when you ignored that topic altogether?
Right. Or as we were talking off camera earlier, by assimilating it that way and by teaching it, then you're not hiring somebody else, I guess, who actually could teach
Well,
that.
ultimately, the book is talking about what does this mean in terms of affirmative action. I definitely see this movement toward false globalization as an undermining of affirmative action in American institutions today.
Yeah. So you relieve your guilty conscience, then you don't have to
There's
hire the black chemist.
There's a pretense. There's a pretense of, well, it comes into the balkanization of faculty members, but there's a pretense that we're engaging the world that we don't have to deal with more serious issues. If we teach African American literature and we force our students to take that as a prerequisite, then we don't have to deal with the fact that we don't have any African American students among the student body, or that we have we neglect hiring African Americans because we are exonerating ourselves by having something on the books. So I'm oftentimes concerned about these issues.
In the couple of minutes we have left, I'd like to at least begin to ask you about your manuscript in progress on travel narratives. This is a topic that people have been writing about these days. Can you just give us a sense of what's different? I mean, you have your own view of things. What's different in the way you're dealing with travel narratives than the way we see it often done today in comparative literature?
I've never thought about it until you just mentioned this.
Uh-huh.
But I want to put order to my life, I suppose. And probably it is an extension of these other inquiries into identity. I'm looking primarily at here the Portuguese and Italian travelers to India in the 16th century, in the 15th and 16th century. And I'm interested in how a lot of people who deal with people working in travel literature in literature departments oftentimes look at interesting things. They look at interesting points of stylistics and thematics. And in that, I've realized, working with several of these scholars, particularly a group of people working in travel narratives out of Lisbon in the last decade, that very few people writing on travel literature touch upon religion, and they do. Historians will touch upon issues of race. That certainly has been done, but I thought it might be fun to look at how are religions configured, and so. There's always a personal story here. My Italian mother would always tell me, one of my myths of childhood was that the Portuguese were different, that the Portuguese did not have the color prejudice that other marauding peoples had. That the Portuguese were interested in conversion, and once they converted, they married. This was part of some sort of funny family mythology. And so this myth of color, lack of color prejudice, which of course many Portuguese believe, I thought was terribly funny and interesting. And I wanted to look at what was the color prejudice among the Portuguese. So I was comparing the discourse on race among the Italian Portuguese travelers. And also I'm looking at the Jesuit letters and how the Jesuits were talking about issues of race and who would they convert, but who would they ordain, more importantly, and what did that entail?
Dorothy, we could go on and on. It's been a great conversation. Thank you very much for being with us.
It's been a lot of fun.
And we've been speaking with Dorothy Figueira, who's visiting from the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Georgia. Thank you for watching.